Welcome to Revolutionary Optimism. Living at this time in history, we are challenged with the convergence of crises that is affecting our daily lives. Issues like economic hardship, a teetering democracy, and the worsening climate emergency have left many Americans feeling more despair than ever. To respond to the challenging times we're living through, physician, humanitarian, and social justice advocate Dr. Paul Zeitz has identified revolutionary optimism as a new cure for hopelessness, despair, and cynicism. Once you commit yourself as a revolutionary optimist, you can bravely unleash your personal power, #unify with others, and accelerate action for our collective repair, justice, and peace. On this podcast, Dr. Zeitz is working to provide you with perspectives from leaders fighting for equity, justice, and peace, on their strategies, insights, and tools for overcoming adversity and driving forward revolutionary transformation with unbridled optimism and real-world pragmatism. In this episode, Dr. Zeitz is talking with Alex Guerrero. Alex Guerrero is a philosopher and legal scholar whose work dives into some of the most pressing questions about democracy and governance. Alex holds a PhD in philosophy and a JD from New York University, as well as an undergraduate degree from Harvard. His research spans moral, legal, and political philosophy, social epistemology, and global philosophical traditions, including African, Latin American, and Native American philosophy. Alex is the author of the newly released book Lottocracy, Why Lotteries Should Replace Elections, where he makes the bold case that the very heart of modern democracy, the election, is fundamentally flawed. For a new democratic future, Alex proposes a radical rethinking of how we select political representatives and advocates for using random selection of citizens by lottery to serve as the policy-making leaders. Alex believes that a lottocracy form of government is the best way to foster political accountability, reduce polarization, and address the challenges of modern governance. Here's your host, Dr. Paul Zeitz.
Hey, Alex, great to have you. Thanks for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Great. And congratulations for the launch of your new book, Lottocracy. I've been digging into it over the holidays, and there's so much to learn from it. And so thank you for all your hard work, which I know took you. How long did it take you?
Gosh, I've probably been working on it at least 15 years, something like that.
God. Wow.
Yeah, a little while. Not always conceived of exactly as it ended up, but basically, yeah, long time.
Yeah. So a big chunk of your adult life was dedicated to this inquiry and this assessment of lottocracy. What I wanted to share with you at the start is that I am hearing people in the democracy movements start to use the word lottocracy. And I feel like it's an early ripple of your work. And so I just think it's really interesting to be able to say all this stuff about deliberative democracy and democracy by assembly and and all the jargon in one word. It kind of is helping me as an advocate to say, I'm talking about lottocracy.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yeah, I think one of the hard things is just trying to figure out what will resonate with people and kind of get them to get excited about the idea.
So that's a great segue to my first question for you, which is, can you help my listeners understand your vision of lottocracy as a new form of democratic governance? Like, give us a synthesis of that, if you could.
Sure. I mean, a big part of it starts with, the first part of the book makes the case that elections have deep flaws. And so a system that has elections kind of anywhere internal to the system might run into significant problems, or at least that's the worry that I explore in the first part of the book. So lottocracy, as I see it, is an attempt to rethink democracy in a way that doesn't have elections anywhere within the system. So it's the basic core of it is having randomly selected people from the political community brought together to serve on single-issue legislative bodies, and the full system would include something like 20 standing, permanent, single-issue legislative bodies focused on different policy areas. So education, agriculture, health, energy. So we could imagine different buckets, different policy division, but having a set of standing, permanent, individual, single-issue legislative bodies, and then having people randomly chosen to serve on those. The lots of choice points about exactly how to do it. What I suggest in the book is to imagine people serving 3-year terms where they wouldn't be forced to serve, but we would try to make it so that people would be excited to do this. So we could pay people, but also we could make sure that they were protected in their current employment so that they wouldn't be penalized for going off to serve. We might try to set up some of these things virtually so people wouldn't have to physically relocate, although I think there's real value to in-person interaction. So that'd be a kind of mix. People wouldn't all change over at the same time. So as I talk about in the book, there'd be 450 people serving on each of these single issue legislative bodies, with 150 of them coming to serve newly each year. And so there'd be veterans who'd have some experience there. The actual structure would be a mix initial agenda setting where they try to talk about what are some of the things that we should be focusing on within this policy domain. And a lot of that would be informed by input from experts and advocates and stakeholders who have views about what needs to be done in those areas. And so informed by that, then the randomly chosen citizens would go forward, come up with proposals, engage in consultation with the broader community, and ultimately come up with policy ideas that then they would be empowered to enact directly. And so that's kind of the full vision, although there's lots of detail about exactly how each of those parts might work.
Right. So just to clarify, you're saying the vision of the 20 bodies that would focus on sectoral, like health or education, that would replace the legislature. Is that right?
That's right. So rather than having a generalist legislature like Congress, there would instead be a network of 20 different single issue legislative bodies. And that would just be, characterizing the legislative branch, right? So then there's still questions of the executive and the judiciary. In the model, as I see it, there wouldn't be an elected executive. And in general, we try to kind of disempower and redistribute a lot of the stuff that's currently done under the heading of the executive to legislative assemblies of this kind. There would be still a need, I think, for a constitutional and various rights that would be enshrined in the Constitution and protected by something like a constitutional court, like a Supreme Court. But again, it might be selected in a very different way than our current court is,
Right.
with no elected officials kind of sitting behind the appointment choices.
So this is a bold, audacious concept that you're putting forward here. I just want to make sure everyone understands that, and also that what I'm excited about your thought leadership here in Lottocracy is that you're unlocking our imaginations so that we can envision a new kind of democratic governance. And that is what is needed now, really to open up this dialogue of possibility instead of like the assumption that we have to continue as is, which we know is not working. But I wanted to ask you, I've already seen some reviews out about your book, and there are some critics of the concept of Lottocracy who argue that the random selection of citizens prevents a sense of accountability, like what occurs in elections, where the people that are elected into office that win those elections, they're held accountable by their constituents, and they're held accountable in their attempt to get reelected as well. So they're not, so there's like an accountability question. So I'd love you to explain how you see the difference between accountability between the election systems versus Lottocracy, and then why is Lottocracy the better approach for accountability?
Yeah, great. So, I mean, I think one of the starting assumptions of that question is that with elections, we actually are getting something like accountability through the electoral mechanism. And obviously, that's the theory. We're picking these people who are supposed to go and act on our behalf and try to help address our problems in a constructive way. And so the first part of the book really argues that that's not what we're seeing through elections. And part of that, I think, runs deep. As we increase the size and scale of the political community, our knowledge of the details of what our representatives are doing really diminishes, and it becomes harder for us to hold them meaningfully accountable. And so I think elections produce a lot of drama and noise, but I don't think they actually do well by getting us meaningful accountability over our elected officials. And I think as a result, many of them are captured by special interests of various kinds, and they're doing the bidding of the elite, of the powerful. And much of this, I think, has become more transparent as we see people sitting in the background pulling the strings and really influencing our elected officials. And I think many people feel a lot of disillusionment and a sense of that they don't have any real accountability. They aren't really being represented. Their problems aren't really being taken seriously or given serious solutions. And so I think that model is kind of broken. I think what we want from our political representatives, whether they're chosen through elections or randomly, is a sense that people in those offices are actually trying to act on behalf of the political community and trying to make things better and to address our actual problems. And so in the book, I talk about this under the heading of political sensibility. Are people kind of in touch with reality and trying to implement solutions to those real problems that we face? And I think accountability in the electoral context is one mechanism to try to bring that about, where we've picked these people who we now need to hold them accountable somehow. With random selection, I think it's a really different story. My sense, the argument I offer is that the reason to expect people randomly chosen to serve on these bodies to work in the public interest is just that they are us. They are just members of the broad public. They are not people who are setting themselves up for a career in politics or in this kind of to become a member of this political class. They are just trying to think about, well, what are our problems in these domains? What are things we should be addressing? What are people like me? I come from a community, I come from a social class, I've got my occupation, I've got my education level, I've got my immigration or housing status. I've got my concerns and I'm bringing them into this body and I'm trying to think about what should we do? How can we actually address some of these problems? Now, obviously, you should worry that people randomly chosen in this way might become targets by the elite who might come in and try to capture them or influence them in various ways. But just as we do with juries, I think we can really police those boundaries much more effectively than we can in the electoral context. Because these randomly chosen people, they don't have to run for office. They don't need to raise millions and millions of dollars to be viable candidates. And so we could see, are they getting paid off on the side in various ways? And a lot of that, I think, could be detected and monitored. And then the hope would be, absent those kind of distorting influences, they would just kind of think about these issues and think about what would be good for their community and think about their problems and try to act to address those. And I think that is what we see in the closest cousin of this, really, which is the citizens' assemblies that have been used around the world. I think we see a lot of genuine good faith participation by people really trying to think about these issues. So in that way, I think we need a kind of moral accountability, but we don't need that kind of being able to kick them out of office accountability to get this kind of good performance while in office, or at least that's the suggestion in the book.
Yeah. So I agree with you 1,000% that most Americans understand that our elected officials are corrupted by special interests, by lobbyists, by the interests of the wealthy elite. And that is why there's such a high level of frustration and disenfranchisement and disillusionment with our current system. I think everyone knows that. And living in Washington and seeing how it works, it's really painful. It's very sad on that point. And your second point about like having actual citizens with lived experience, real world people making policy decisions and legislating, if you will, on behalf of the public. We had a guest earlier last year, Terry Barishis, who told the story when he was a lawmaker and they were working at the state legislature and they were doing housing reform. And none of the people rented, a renting reform, and none of the members of the legislature were renting. So they had no one that actually knew what was going on in that zone. And so the idea of a citizens' assembly, where you have a variety of people with different lived experience, some renting, some owning, et cetera, then you get a full 360-degree view of the housing situation, and then you can create better solutions. So I think that point you made is really, really important. Great. So I think the next big question that I have and others have about Lottocracy is, if you're doing democracy by assembly, or you're doing sortition, random selection at the national level, which I guess this would be, how do you ensure that you're getting the diversity of perspectives in terms of gender and race and geography and ethnicity? I mean, that's one lens of questions, and the other lens is an interpartisan lens. How do you let me hold off on the interpartisan? Let's just start with the demographic question.
Yeah, I mean, so one way of hearing the question is kind of at the level of the mechanics of it. How would we actually put it in place? In terms of making everybody register, to have their name possibly be drawn from the giant pool of people. So I think there are serious questions there. I don't mean to downplay the logistical issues of setting that up. But that is the kind of hope I would have, is that we put some sort of system like that in place where everybody would be registered. I mean, there's questions of exactly how to define those borders. So, one way of doing it is just everybody who's currently eligible to vote would be eligible to be in the pool. Another version would expand it even beyond that. So, people who are currently incarcerated, or longtime permanent residents, lawful legal permanent residents who haven't become citizens yet. So we could imagine extending it in various ways, but for simplicity, let's just stick with people who are eligible to vote. And then, in many ways, it'd be like, the same mechanisms by which, we sort of monitor who's eligible and who can register. Ideally, my hope would be a kind of opt-in, a model where you have to opt out of being in the pool, so that we'd get many, many more people than are currently registered to vote, say. And I think one of the important questions is, can we build enough public awareness around these institutions? And then can we also incentivize participation in the right ways so that people don't try to get out of it or don't try to turn it down? My own view is that it shouldn't be compulsory. So some people defend a view on which, randomly choose people and force them to serve on these kinds of institutions. And I think that's not the way to go, partly because you can't force people to do a good job, right? So you want people who are there and genuinely motivated. So maybe different than jury service, where people are sort of legally required to serve. I think the better route to go here is pay people a significant amount so that they feel rewarded and appropriately compensated for their time. And it would be significant for many people to have to do this. I think also building the civic culture around it, so that this was seen as an important public service, an important part of your being a citizen. Now, having said all that, if we ran the lottery and it turned out we saw noticeable skew in terms of gender or race or ethnicity or income or any of those kind of demographic components, I think that would be cause for investigation. So the hope would be, we want a genuine microcosm, randomly selected, just using kind of the laws of statistics. You'd hope for that over time. In any one sample, it might not be perfectly, demographically proportionate. I personally think that's fine. I'm not in favor of stratified sampling, where we try to make sure that literally every single assembly, every single issue legislative body chosen was an exact mirror of the broader public. Partly because I think we then have to think about what are the dimensions of diversity that matter for politics and stratify along those and oversample in some cases. But all of that, I think, is highly political, and there's no neutral way of trying to decide, well, what are the dimensions of demographic difference that matter for this? So my own preference is just put everybody in the
Sure,
pool,
sure.
pure random selection, incentivize participation, and then monitor to see if we're getting skew in terms of the actual people showing up to participate. Now, the way citizens' assemblies are often run, it's not that at all, right? So in many cases, there's already a somewhat poorly designed initial recruitments, where maybe you're using a home address or something, mailing people envelopes that they have to return back. That's already going to bias the sample a bit. In many cases, people aren't paid at all for their time, or paid very little. It often is kind of being fit into the weekend, which doesn't work for a lot of people. And so if you look at some of the citizens' assemblies around the world, they don't look demographically representative. And I think that's a problem. That's something that, we need to try to figure out how to create the right kind of structure. Obviously, it's harder when you're doing this, building new institutions along the way. In the book, I just imagine, kind of the ideal endpoint if we were embracing my full vision for things. This is how it would look. There might be difficulties along the way in sort of building things when they're smaller, less well funded, have less public support, less public education.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of something I learned about the British Columbia Citizens Assembly held in 2004 that was focused on electoral reform. They did do a Lottocracy attempt, at the first phase, and after they did that, they saw that there were no indigenous people from any of the indigenous tribes that are from that geography that were selected. So they modified the selection and allowed for a targeted selection of indigenous people from who had attended like some of the preparatory assemblies. So I don't know, that was an innovation to deal with something that would have brought into question the legitimacy of the assembly if a subpopulation was totally not part of it, like a critical one, like indigenous populations.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a real world example of the kind of questions that we'll have to deal with.
Yeah.
The other question I wanted to ask you was about the approach towards interpartisanship, is what I call it, where you have representatives from across the political spectrum, including the two major parties and all the factions within those parties, say, plus the independents and all the third parties, and also more importantly, non-voting Americans, like non-participating Americans that aren't participating in the electoral system. How do we make sure all those perspectives are systematically included? So I think you already answered the question in your prior answer, though.
Well, no, but it's, I think, good to highlight that, well, many things might be different in a full Lottocracy without elections anywhere. One of the things that would almost certainly be different is the current structure of political parties, like which parties would exist. Would they be generalist parties in the way that we see them now, or would we see much more by way of focused advocacy organizations focused on kind of advocating within a single issue space? One of the things that I think is exciting about moving away from elections and moving away from generalist legislatures is that there might be lots of issues where we, the people, have a lot of common cause and agree quite a bit. Elections really foreground those issues where we're most divided. Elected politicians have an incentive to play those up, to highlight the way in which they're very different from their opponent, and to get you very upset about imagining their opponent actually in office. With single issue legislative bodies, I think we might see all kinds of policymaking happen in areas that currently get kind of locked out and shuffled to the side because they're not places where we have a lot of disagreement, and they're places where elite capture and special interest lobbying have really created a kind of collusion between the major parties so that we don't see real agenda setting, real reform in those areas. So,
Can you give me an example of that? Like how you see that happening, like a real world example?
Yeah, I mean, so I think even just thinking about how progressive the tax rate should be, or something like that, in terms of taxing, people with vast amounts of money more, this might be something, this should be low hanging fruit. Like, most Americans are like, yes, this is absurd. Nobody should have this much money. Or certainly they should pay significant taxes on it. Large corporations shouldn't be able to so easily evade taxes, and we should definitely try to audit them more to make sure they're paying their fair share. This is massively popular with the general public, especially if framed in the right way, and very unpopular with the most wealthy people who would really like to avoid this kind of thing. And so that's a place where I think, if we could work together, we'd get really different policy. Or something like, affordable housing. A lot of places, I think, the issue gets framed adversarially in a way that's completely unnecessary. But part of the background assumptions involve, the people who control like large housing development and, a lot of policy in that area. And so they lobby very effectively to create regulations and zoning requirements of various kinds that really make it so that they are going to, maximize profit, and in a way that might be, highly unpopular for most people. Or, I think there's a lot of issues having to do with climate change where, in terms of many people are very worried about these things, especially for their children and their children's children, and would like more to be done. But at the same time, what gets foregrounded in that space is often some of the least good ideas that would be highly unpopular because the elite who control a lot of the industries that would be taxed or regulated or even pushed out of existence are not excited about these changes. And so as a result, we're told, oh, it's going to mean massive taxes for you as the gas buying consumer, rather than other alternatives where we might in other ways encourage or incentivize use of fewer fossil fuels. And so I think there's a lot of room for kind of policy design and innovation that would be quite popular. But we end up talking about, hot button social and cultural issues where there is a lot of disagreement and division, and the elites can kind of distract our attention from the things that would more directly affect their pocketbook.
Exactly. And that's all by design, right? We know that the duopoly operates by design to create polarization so they maintain their power and control.
Yeah.
And those corporate oligarchic interests are embedded in both political parties, and it sort of feeds off each other in a very tragic way. And these major opportunities that you just laid out are elusive, and we're going actually in the complete opposite direction of that. So that's why I do believe, I'm hoping that Lottocracy and democracy by assembly is on the upswing, because this is a solution that can reconstruct how our democracy works, and actually come up with like common sense solutions, like you just said, like tax and make the money more equitably available.
Yeah.
Like, let's deal with the climate emergency for real
Yeah.
and not pretend, because you're right, our children and grandchildren, future generations are highly threatened by the lack of action. So I'm totally with you on all that. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned as I'm delving into Lottocracy and democracy by assembly is that you will get a diverse range of political views, like from the left and the right and the center. And by bringing folks together, like you describe in your book, and you go through a learning experience and a deliberation experience, and then a process of reaching consensus, that you end up getting win-win solutions that the majority of people across the political spectrum can agree to. Not 100%, but you can get a majority or a supermajority. And I think that possibility is something, and it's been demonstrated around the world. So this isn't just theoretical, it's actually been operationalized. So do you agree with that? Have I learned that in the correct way?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, it's really important that these institutions wouldn't erase our deep disagreements, right? Like we still would have all kinds of things that we don't all agree to. And in a way, that's why you need politics. That's why you need political institutions at all, to sort of help us work together to solve our problems, to address our problems, even when we don't agree on exactly what to do. If we all agreed, we just could do it without any of these institutions. So I think that's an important part. But it's like, how are we processing our disagreements? Are we focusing on things where we actually are disagreeing? And then we should think about how can we reconcile some of that disagreement? Are the institutions helping us work through our disagreements productively and coming out on the other side with something that looks like a good idea, something that we can live with, even if we don't all agree? And there might be places where we can't all agree, and then maybe we can try to work on other things, right? So we don't need to work out every disagreement before we can work on some other issues. So I think it's very much not the view that we should always aim for consensus or something like that, or that any institution can help make sure that we all have the same view or agree about things. So one of the things I really try to avoid in the book and in talking to people about it is any kind of suggestion that, well, this is, if you like, liberal left democratic policy, this is the kind of institution that'll help you get that. Because I don't think it is. I think it's sort of neutral substantively about what it actually would bring about. And it'll just depend on the people who are brought randomly into these bodies. So exactly what they'll do, I can't say or predict. But I do think these institutions would help people figure that out in a more reasonable, sensible, kind of justified way, and in a way that's more respectful and that actually helps people listen to each other and hear where other people are coming from rather than polarizing us, making us hate each other, which is what I think we're kind of getting through electoral politics these days.
Yeah. I think there's some recent evidence on what you're on that point about that the outcome of these deliberations, or like a citizens assembly or a legislature by Lottocracy, may not be what I would want personally. And that is one of the things that I've been exploring myself personally. Like, I'm an advocate for this and that perspective, but now as I'm advocating for citizens assembly, I actually have to give that up, and I have to give up like knowing what the outcome will be or ensuring that the outcome will be what I want. And an interesting example of this was a deliberative youth effort that Stanford held right before the 2024 election. And they had youth from around the country come together, and they kind of came up with some solutions that I was like surprised. They were not willing to give up fossil fuels right away, but they also came up with a consensus on things that were, the people on the right side shifted left too. And so people on the left shifted right. There was like shifting in both directions. So I think that is the power of Lottocracy, is that you really do get, you unlock the polarization, and you get actual learning and growth, and everyone can shift, and you can get better solutions from what your preconceived notions might be. So that's really accurate what you said. So I want to shift gears a little bit, and we talked a little bit about the theory of Lottocracy. Now I want to get your take on where we're at in the United States. We have a system of elected government that has been established in our Constitution, which is 237 years old. That kind of electoral system has been replicated globally. So most countries are now doing some form of elections. So, what do you think? Where do you think our democracy is in terms of its health and well-being? And are we at a what do you think? Where are we in the history of our democracy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not a historian. I think, though, it is easy to get a bit caught up in the present and think, well, this is, clearly the height of the crisis of democracy. But I really don't think that. I mean, I think obviously just within US history, there have been moments where, the Civil War, for example, where things were much more divided and things actually fell apart and there was fragment and war and this kind of, massively violent division. And so I don't think necessarily that we are at some crisis point. I do think for many people, there's a sense that at one point people might have said something like electoral democracy. It's the pinnacle. It's the ideal form of government. It works well under all circumstances, or it's what we should all be aiming for no matter what. And I think people are starting to notice there are background conditions that are making it so that it doesn't seem like it's working all that well. One of these, I think, is the mass information environment. How do we get information about politics? Are we able to learn about the world so that I can learn about problems that are affecting people thousands of miles from me in a way where it's really tracking reality? And I think there's a story to tell, and I try to tell some of it in the book about the transformation in the press and the media, the transformation from having largely common epistemic sources where most of us would get our information from similar sources that were using similar journalistic standards. And, cable news media opened that up, got a lot of segmentation, much more politicized, polarized news. And then the internet and social media and algorithms that reinforce our biases and background views has just exploded this problem, I think. And we're only going to see more of it as we see AI generated content and more fake news and misinformation and disinformation. And all of that in the background, I think, makes it really hard for mass elections to continue to function well. And I think many people are on some level feeling this. And another thing it does, I think, is contribute to division and polarization as people get their information about the world from very different sources, and they come to see people who have very different views than they do as either deeply misguided or stupid or evil or some combination of those. And it's going to be really hard, I think, to rebuild the political community in a way that will sustain that. So I think all of that creates difficulty for electoral democracy. And I think one of the things I hope for in the book, and this came out earlier a little bit, is I don't care if you like Lottocracy or not. I mean, I'd love it if everyone liked it, but more important to me is that people start thinking more imaginatively about other kinds of political forms, other political institutions, other systems that maybe incorporate election but do it differently, or maybe use other alternative mechanisms. Because I worry that it's a kind of technology that we've created, and it might have reached a point where it's no longer likely to function all that well. Another thing I talk about in the book are the ways in which elections provide a kind of short-term attention and incentivization so that we pay a lot of attention to the really near term, but do less well at addressing long-term problems. And I think climate change is really a perfect example of this. It's hard not to imagine people living 50 or 100 years from now looking back at this time and being, what were you doing? You all knew basically what was happening to Earth. You all knew this was our one place, and you just didn't do much at all to actually change course in response to that knowledge. And I think our political institutions are really failing us. And I think that's where electoral democracy is really failing us. And, so that for me, a lot of it is, let's start opening these questions and teaching, children, rather than just, electoral democracy. This is the pinnacle form of government. Everything else is some form of authoritarian, disaster, monarchy, or something. Don't teach them that. Think, well, this is one thing we came up with, but there might be many other ways of trying to work together to address our problems in ways that are respectful and equitable and that treat people as equals. And, so that's where I think the conversation should be. And not just thinking about, let's elect a better person for the next time around, because I think that's where a lot of the energy goes. And I worry, although that's important, it is, very short term, and it might not really be addressing some of these fundamental issues. And so at most, it might be a kind of like, maybe we'll get lucky and get a good person for a few years. But I think the broader concerns run deeper.
Yes, thank you for that. I have so many questions. I don't know, my head's spinning. The question that you were talking about the broken system, and yes, we have to keep working on getting the best possible electeds, and all the energy that goes into that. We saw billions and billions being spent on that in this last election cycle last year, and I've been like wanting to explore, and I am exploring, and I'd like to ask you, like, there's everyone is now leveraging the new government, and everyone is like, or resisting the new government, but they're all focused on what currently exists. And I'm like trying to create a new space where we ask people to help build the new system. And I've been advocating for a fourth branch of government, a citizens' assembly, as a transitional approach to a full autocracy, where we could have electeds and selecteds, but the selected through a democratic lottocracy structure would have impact. There would be a forcing mechanism that their deliberations would lead to legislation or referendum or some real world impact. And sometimes I get pessimistic, and I feel like this is like too big and too dreamy. So I wonder, on a personal level now, do you ever get hopeless and despairing, and how do you get yourself out, if that ever happens to you? How do you get back to the visionary and the optimist?
Yeah, it's a great question also. I mean, I come to this maybe from the enviable position of being a philosopher. So I never expected to have any impact, really. Like, I think I thought a lot of my impact would come through giving people a chance to think about interesting ideas and, giving people some, you know, texts and resources and concepts to play with and to help them kind of think about the world. And so that in a way, sort of has meant I never had that much by way of concrete hopes for adoption or alteration or transformation. That being said, of course, I would, like anyone else, like to see things get better in various ways. And there's a question of how that can happen. So I really try to take that up at the end of the book. And, one of the things I say is very much like what we're sort of just suggesting, thinking about transition and how might we get from where we are to something better. And I think a lot of it will require kind of small scale experimentation, trying things out, seeing what works, seeing what kinds of institutions seem to contribute in a positive way, and trying to get people excited about building these things and thinking about politics in a different way. And my sense when I go around and talk to people about this is there's a lot of hunger, there's a lot of deep emotional energy that needs to find a home that's positive and optimistic and not just despairing. And I think for a lot of people, that traditionally has been let's find a candidate that we support and get behind that person, or let's find some policy and try to advocate for that. I think more and more people are finding that to seem like despair rather than energizing. And so one thing I've tried to suggest to people is, well, let's think about what could you build locally? What are the things that you might be able to create in some direction, in terms of assemblies. And often I think it will start small, municipal, county, maybe state government, rather than federal level. And so that's where I think more energy should be placed. I also think, life is long and a lot of these things take a long time to happen, but then all of a sudden they happen. And I think it's hard to predict when that all of a sudden moment will be. And so part of it is just trying to push things a little in that direction. And I've been amazed in the 15 years I've been working on this. Such a dramatic worldwide movement has really grown up around the idea of sortition and citizens' assemblies and really trying to build these things. The United States is in a way very far behind other places where these have started to become somewhat regular parts of the political conversation. And so that's really encouraging and makes me think there's some real idea there that people are being drawn to and excited about. So that all gives me hope. And I think, it's a long game, but it feels exciting to be involved, at this level. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate the perspective of your optimism and the context of that. I also noted in the book towards the end, you talk about revolutionary moments or actions that can be taken. And since this is the Revolutionary Optimism Podcast, and I'd love to hear your kind of as a final, question, like how do you see these revolutionary moments? For example, we don't know what's going to happen with this new MAGA government. Um, we do know that there is a massive resistance occurring, and depending on how things go, it could lead to a flashpoint. It could lead to mass resistance, and it could lead to, like you said, there are these moments of transformation. So I'd love to hear your philosophical, legal perspectives on revolutionary actions that my listeners can explore.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question also. I think so. I, maybe counter a bit to the revolutionary sentiment. I think we're in a difficult time in some ways. So most of what we're encountering is, I think, really serious, highly dysfunctional. but often embedded within broadly somewhat functional institutions, right? And things that are not, for the most part, directly oppressing people and rounding them up and doing the kinds of things that I think would really require and merit some sort of more direct, immediate, revolutionary, perhaps even violent response. And so I think it's hard because we're working with deeply flawed institutions, but at the same time, I think they work much better than many things might. And I think we should be quite cautious in trying to bring about some alteration through revolutionary kinds of means, partly because I feel like often those revolutionary strategies end up leading to all kinds of other
The
devastation
backlash from
and
them,
all
yeah.
kinds of other difficulties of their own. But also, I worry we have to learn quite a bit more about what would actually work better. So, this is one of the challenges. I think, electoral representative systems aren't working well. They aren't working ideally, certainly. But there are many things that are much worse. And so, we're at a different moment than people in other places where they were living under the thumb of an autocrat and they thought almost anything would be better than this. And I think for many of us, we acknowledge the flaws and the deep problems while at the same time thinking this is quite good, much better than most people in human history have had it by way of political systems and political institutions. So as long as that remains true, I think transformation and change has to happen in a somewhat different way. And one
Hmm.
of the ways in which I think we should be like moving at a small scale experimental design kind of model is trying to think about what actually does seem to work better. Now we might well come to a point, some sort of inflection moment where there are more serious things being threatened, and that might require a different kind of response. I mean, there's interesting ideas. There's a philosopher, Christopher Zern, who has a book called Splitsville, where he argues for the dissolution of the United States into five separate political communities on the grounds that we are just very far apart on many issues and we would do better by everybody going our separate ways. And I think that kind of thing should also be part of the conversation. If we start seeing one side trying to lord it over the other, or turn the United States into some sort of religious theocracy or something. These are ideas that might have at one point seemed absurd, but I think unfortunately we're confronting some of them again in more or less significant places. And so I think yeah, that might be another kind of response that is ultimately needed. Like, well, should we all be in a political community together? And under what circumstances is that the right thing? And so that's obviously a kind of revolutionary response of a different kind. But I think I personally am very wary of calls to revolution. I think they're often kind of dangerous, and I think I love the title of the podcast, Revolutionary Optimism, because I think what we want to bring is a revolutionary spirit or energy
Right.
to what might feel sometimes like kind of mundane, grinding it out, working in the trenches kind of work. And so, I'm not always impressed by people who want to like sit in a room and plan the revolution and then go burn some stuff down. But the hard work of building something new and something better, that's a really different kind of challenge than just throwing something into the works to blow it all up. So that to me does make the challenge difficult. So I think that's kind of an ongoing thing. How do we keep people optimistic and energized, while also maybe telling them the work is going to be hard and often not as grand in scale? Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for those perspectives and for your insights and wisdom and for your, courage and bravery for coming out with Lottocracy and, opening up our imaginations about what's possible as we grapple with our the failures of our electoral system that focuses on elections only as a way of generating ideas and leadership. So I really appreciate your work and thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing how Lottocracy takes off and unlocks citizens' assemblies all over the place, as you say. And the years ahead will be interesting, and look forward to having you back sometime down the road.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for all the work that you're doing. It's very exciting.
Thank you, Alex Guerrero, for your amazing work, for your leadership, your academic leadership in philosophy and law, and your work on Lottocracy, a 15-year endeavor to really unlock our political imagination about what would a democracy look like without elections. The idea of democracy by assembly, mobilizing citizens' assemblies to be leading policy and leading the development of how our government would function. This is a bold, audacious set of ideas, and I appreciated Alex's persistent optimism in the face of Lottocracy skeptics, my own skepticism about being able to shift to a Lottocracy. And then I think I heard a lot of pragmatism from Alex about the transition from where we are now to where we want to go. And the idea of having experimentation happening at the local, state level, and I would argue also at the national level. So I think he opens up the possibilities for all that to be happening at a more rapid pace. And I look forward to learning more about how Lottocracy is being studied and explored in the United States and around the world. So thank you, Alex, for your revolutionary optimism.
Are you ready to be part of the revolution? To learn more about revolutionary optimism, please visit revolutionaryoptimism.com. To get to know Dr. Zeitz, please visit drpaulzeitz.org. And to explore building movements, please visit unifymovements.org. If you like this show, be sure to follow on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss an episode. Revolutionary Optimism, transforming the world one episode at a time.